So this was correct. Sorry. Sorry. For 3 years before us. So I'm the third person now. So now I'm starting to see. So yeah, I wish this was darker because you can't see. Yeah. Unless I'll get something now. Yeah, or I can change the color of glass. Because the lady is yeah, this picture from so I'm really listening to the presentation now. That's the two people seated over there. That's what the one says. And she thought it so. One so bad. Yeah, just today, which are things started and negotiating. That's the only reason, sir. So that's yeah, that's better. Maybe I should make it once. Maybe that's not okay. Black will cover though. Yeah, because background is black. I think this is like it's better. It's much better than so yeah. Which one should we put it as white? No, you look at it. Oh, it's better. Okay, that's good. Okay, right. I think that. Yeah. Hey, hold on. She's up there. That place. Let's go back to the next slide. Today. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But they take on your more serious. You said, how long, sir? I can't eat because they were doing table by table. And I said, oh, no, I don't have time for this. So, yeah. It's easy to just walk straight in out. The service. Everything waited. Okay. Now. It's okay. Okay. It's okay. Yeah. Okay. Does it work with the heater? If it doesn't, I'm trying to. Okay. It's working. Okay. So I don't next after this, you have to go through all this. So is the Zoom set up on the setup is on the Zoom because yeah. So set up is it very first time now. So let me try. Can I look at yeah. So which first step is the buffer? Yes. Can you I'm not sharing screen here. I have to share screen here. Okay. Now, no, you have to go into this. You want to work here? No, okay. Yeah. Can I make a correction here? Okay, can you your back? Okay, you can drink. We have Hey, it's all about just you need to say I know. You have to have this also. And so don't go close. You understand? So no, we have this one. I close that one. Yeah, just use two. Yeah, if you want to, also you can save it on the desktop. You are scared. So just save it. No, we need like the chair of Google. The chair of Google says that. So the chair of Google house.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí.
Let's do it one more time. Someone's time. So we should go. So you do us to for the protection modes. I don't know presentation. I said start this lunch. I have that. That's the done process. No, always this one is no, that's notes. This one, no, So one thing I need to show is this. It's always this way. That's right. Yeah. So make sure two things. You go to the box, click for it, and it out. It can go off. Go off. No, go off. So when you go off to the bottom, click that. Click this.
Hi, folks. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
Hello. It must be in the wee hours of the morning there.
Yeah, let's not talk about that.
Hello.
I'm okay. Obviously, I wish I was there, better in person.
Yeah, we miss you for real.
I miss you guys so much. I mean, but it's condition, as they say.
Yeah, condition closer.
Abby, come. Do you have a slideshow? Really? Am I dreaming, or did I see that?
That what?
I have a PowerPoint.
No. He's just. I think he's just. I think he's the only one doing the power.
Oh,
Oh my goodness.
I think just everybody, everyone doing the power.
you know, as an architectural historian,
Yeah, you have to show. Yeah, you have to. And also, I think for Vicky, who is able to come as well, she's not feeling too well. Yeah, she would have used the PowerPoint as well because she does what we have to do. So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh Lordy, what a
What you
thing.
guys do? Even for the presentation. Yes, because I think because of
Yeah, I think it could be. Well, if you can't.
You shift it back, you don't make it.
Yes, sir.
Come station for us.
Yeah. So
We can't say, this is here, okay. Otherwise. What's going on? This thing is real. So are you charging? You should charge. You don't charge, you have to open the phone and charge it. Wait, hold on.
We're only first.
Yeah.
I was saying.
I've seen questions in my life. The projector. So, it does this project. What's the time now? We're on something just small.
And what we don't ask for us, you can. Smaller.
Right? Yeah. Where do you get our project?
Go back, put it back to. It's not extended.
Very nice. Especially for sausage. It's and those are the try of substantive.
Yeah. Yes, so we're about to start. Yeah.
And then I go to that so far and so and then no one is right. I said that so happy like what is it like?
Okay. Yes, sir. You still use that. So, no, I just like one way I said.
Already can make sure that you see so I don't
No, no.
it's fine. I just want to be sure that's not the story. Oh yeah,
So are we still waiting for any other final?
Yes.
Okay, she's here.
Like trying to find a
That seems to hold first.
I am.
As not first start. As in before next year.
I'm seeing the palm of your people side. There's 1, 2, 3.
Can we see?
Hi, folks. I'm not sure what happened, but I can't hear you or see you anymore.
Everything. Okay. How are you? You're good to go. Can you hear us, ma?
Can you see me? Hi.
Sir, sir, are you like ready to start or you still want to be doing? Okay, for her to start. Excuse me, sir. Sorry, sir, please, can you help me pronounce the surname? Because I have to read this out once it starts. I want to pronounce the surname. Echeruo.
Number 3.
Okay. I'll go first then. With the coincidence, you know.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to session 4F, engaging myself. Echeruo, Victorian Lagos, 1977, 45 years later. So this is the first part and it's only person. So Saz and Max would love if you can help us come forward a bit and help reduce your phones or if possible, like put it on silent so I'm not to distract the session. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. My name is 15am-10, and I'm a historian based at York University in Toronto, Canada at the moment. And it's really nice to see all the faces in the room. I wasn't really expecting to have people that will be interested in Echeruo's work, considering that it's an old book and it's a niche topic, but seeing the faces in the room and knowing that they are all people who have read or at least engaged with Echeruo's work at some point in the past gives me joy. I am doubling as more like the moderator, but as well as the chair and as well as the co-organizer with my colleague Alimat Titilola Shomoto, who will be joining us in the afternoon by Zoom. She's going to be chairing the afternoon session. And Professor Olukoju is unavoidably absent. He's not feeling well. That's why he's unable to join us this morning. So welcome to our first panel. This is the first of 2 sessions. Please note that the second session is full Zoom. There is no in-person component. So please log into through the links in your programs in the afternoon at 3:45 p.m. in the afternoon. We're going to be having more speakers in the afternoon than now, actually, because of the time zone differences. We have someone zooming in from Japan, Nozomi Sawada. Then we have people zooming in from the US as well, and all other places. We've tried to assemble a diverse group of multidisciplinary historians of Lagos. Okay. So I'd like to offer some preliminary remarks and then my 30 seconds reflection. I wasn't meant to speak, actually. I was just meant to moderate, but I'd like to offer that, and then I'll open the floor to Dr. Ademide Adelusi, and then followed by Dr. Bosede Judge, and then Dr. Teriba here present. So this project actually began during a casual phone conversation with my friend and colleague Alimat Shomoto at Auburn University. It was in November 2022, and I was visiting Auburn the following month. So we had a chance to talk about it in more detail. And the idea was that we thought that Victorian Lagos, the book by Michael Echeruo, was a classic in Lagos history, published in 1977 and has remained relevant amongst those who study Lagos history. and we thought it deserves to be celebrated. We also believe that the ideas in the book deserve to be revisited by present-day historians working on Lagos. Victorian Lagos was first published in 1977, and that was a time when the vast majority of scholars that are now actively researching Lagos were not even born. 1977 is about how many years ago today now? 46. So most of the younger scholars who were actively working on Lagos today were not even born when that book was published. Or those who were born were undergraduate students, at least. The senior scholars today were mostly undergraduate students at that time. And so it is surprising that that book, 45, 46 years later, has continued to draw readers across a wide range of audiences that are interested in 19th century Lagos. And despite the fact that it's a small volume, thankfully we have a physical copy here, so it's just a small volume. It's comprehensive in its, all right, overcheck that. Sorry, there's a word in my mind that I'm struggling to pronounce. It's originally French. Scope, yeah, French scope is a good. Anyways, I can write it, but to pronounce is a different problem. So, and it covers, he has chapters spanning music, education, religion, all aspects of cultural life in 19th century Lagos. And although the author was not a trained historian, he was a professor of English. The book has been continuously cited in colonial scholarship for over 4 decades. And it's been out of print. That's the surprising thing about it. It's been out of print for many years. And so the second thing we also want to do was to critically revisit the ideas in the book and their applications in legal studies today. So we decided to assemble a group of interdisciplinary legal scholars to critically explore the ways in which the book can serve as a springboard for more research on pre-20th century Lagos. Some of the questions that we're interested in and we've shared with the presenters before now, some of the questions would be, whose Lagos was Echeruo writing about? Like, who were the people he was writing about? Was it the Lagos of the indigenous Lagosians or the Lagos of the Western educated elite? Then besides newspapers that he used as a source, and I see Dr. Oke in the room who also works on newspaper sources. Besides newspapers, the question is which other sources can provide alternative or complementary insights on 19th century Lagos life? And we've highlighted cartography, maps, photography, oral histories, architecture, etc. Another aspect of material culture. And then we're also hoping to interrogate how the book has actually transformed our understanding of modernity in the Black Atlantic, 19th century Black Atlantic world. And again, how can we recover the voices of non-Western educated people? And then how did Victorian Lagos compare or contrast with other Black Atlantic urban centers of the period? And today, we're pleased to have assembled some of the finest, and I mean that sincerely, scholars to discuss the topic. Professor Lukuju would have been the chair. Dr. Ademide is a historian of Lagos, originally a computer scientist turned historian, who now does fantastic work on maps, cartography in Lagos. And her book is now, is it out yet or is it still forthcoming? But I know it's coming out. We've seen the photo of the cover page already. Yeah, we're looking forward to reading that. And then we also have Dr. Abosede George, whose deep understanding of the Lagos urban space is reflected through a study of gender, childhood, and what she terms eco-politanism, which is a concept that I'm hoping you get into, or maybe I'll ask some other time. And then we have Dr. Teriba, Alidoyi Teriba, who is an architect and an urban historian, architectural historian, and who is able to reconstruct the history of Lagos through photographies and material culture in ways in which traditional historians like myself would not be able to do. So for those who do not know, Michael Echeruo, the author, is an accomplished professor, and for someone distinguished as he is, he's still alive. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to bring him here. His online profile and general internet presence are sketchy. as distinguished as he is. It consists of a few web pages, but we know that he was born on Sunday, March 14, 1937, in the Okigwe district of the colonial Owerri province of colonial southern Nigeria, but now in Imo states. He was educated at the University of Ibadan, and then went to Cornell, where he got his PhD in 1965, right? Professor Echeruo worked at various institutions of learning in Nigeria, particularly at Enugu and Nsukka, an institute, Nigerian College of Arts in Enugu, the University UNA in Nsukka. And at the peak of his career in Nigeria, he returned to UI, University of Ibadan, where he became a professor of English. And then after serving in a variety of administrative posts, he became one of the victims of the structural adjustment policy inspired brain drain of the 1980s. So, I mean, most of the scholars, the senior scholars of this generation, you notice they left Nigeria usually between the mid-80s and the mid-90s, all part of the structural adjustment induced brain drain, which led to, which affected the plight of academics in Nigerian institutions. And as the plight of Nigerian academics got worse under Babangida, many of these guys relocated to Western institutions. So Echeruo left Nigeria in 1989, and then got to Syracuse after a visiting position at Indiana in 1990, and he remained there where he had an endowed chair and retired about 9 or 10 years ago. So while we are reviewing his pioneering cultural history of Lagos today, I'd like to note that Echeruo's offerings to academia are quite many and also diverse. He's a poet of notable repute. He's a literary critic whose writings spanned African and European literature across several historical periods. And he could also be regarded as a linguist based on his extensive work that resulted in the Dictionary of the Igbo language published by Yale in 1998. So now to the subject of the panel. When Victorian Lagos was published in 1977, it was groundbreaking, in my opinion, for at least two reasons. One, it was a cultural history project at a time that historians were enamored with political history, questions of nation building, biographies of big men, mostly men, and some economic history, and other things related to nation building in general. So it was unique in that sense, that it was a cultural history project. Secondly, it used newspapers as its main source. And while newspapers have been used by Nigerian scholars since the 1950s, it was often regarded as inferior to traditional archives consisting of colonial correspondence. And in fact, one may argue that only a literary scholar like Echeruo could have written a history book based almost entirely on newspaper records in the 1970s. Because in the history departments, even today, when you want to write using newspaper sources extensively, you have to justify why you're using newspapers and not the traditional archives or ethnographical research and all of those things, even in 2023. So you can then go back to 1977. He relied entirely on that. My interest in Echeruo's work isn't much about the content of the book, but more about his method. And it's because I have also worked using newspaper sources, because I study, right now I'm working on my first monograph on the history of electrification, electricity supply in Nigeria, but I went back to the mid-19th century, looking at the ideas of electricity in newspaper records, and the first article from that project is actually published, which spanned that the period between the 1860s and 1914, looking at the ideas of electricity in newspapers, how the Lagos intelligentsias were trained, and how they actually learned the principles of electricity even before the light bulb was invented, and right there in Lagos at the CMS Grammar School, and how there were public lectures in Lagos. You know, the Lagos Life all reflected through newspapers that were thankfully digitized by the British Library, so I can just do keyword search. You know, I don't have to like read through 60 years, you know, page by page. and they're available, I think, for remote access, maybe through your universities, or you can write to them directly to grant you access if one is based here. And I found that the newspapers of the 1860s to 1914, they are indispensable. If you want to study that period, you can't avoid them because they're more like a one-stop shop. So things that became things that were eventually published as separate documents, like colonial legislative council reports, governor's address, budgets, advertisements, yellow pages, trade journals, everything you find them in the newspapers. From the 1910 onwards, they had their own specialized outlets. And because of the nature of archival practices in Nigeria, it's often difficult to recover all of these sources in chronological order today. And as Michael Echeruo notes, it's actually difficult to think of any aspect of Lagos life in the 19th century, which is not thoroughly illuminated by comments, letters, and news stories of the local press. However, it is important to note, and others may agree or disagree, that Echeruo's book barely scratched the surface when it comes to the opportunities available for newspaper research in the 19th century. And even though Echeruo mentions in the book's preface, for those who have read it, he actually mentioned in the preface that he lost most of his original research. So this is actually based on what he was able to recover after, I think it was after the Civil War. And so he lost most of the original research. And so I was really impressed because if this is just what he was able to recover, I was wondering what we would have found in the original trove that he had initially assembled. And today, giants, including distinguished colleagues in this room, have risen on Echeruo's shoulders, and they're pushing the boundaries of knowledge of 19th and early 20th century Lagos in new light. And I am looking forward to learning from everyone this morning. And so this is where I stop. Like I said, it's just preliminary remarks. I'm not even supposed to speak for this long. So now I'm going to open the floor to Dr. Ademide. We are just 3 presenters and a few people in the room, but I'm hoping if it's possible to limit presentations to around no more than 12 minutes. I spoke for about 10 minutes. Anyways, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear, and we can see you.
Great. Thank you so much for the great introduction and putting this together. I put together some images that I had. Can you see what I'm sharing?
Yeah.
Can you see it? It should say Rethinking Old Lagos. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, excellent. All right, great. So this should take about maybe 9 minutes. So we'll move on quickly. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I can't see you right now, but hopefully later when the camera turns around, I'll see everyone who's there. Thank you for coming. And of course, to the panel organizers, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all about this book and to think about the potential research and writings that can also follow from looking at Michael Echeruo's work. So now that I know how to pronounce it, so thank you for that as well. I've arranged my short responses into 3 parts. The first, in reflecting on the context of the production of the book and its sources. Secondly, thinking about my own research and how it sort of comes together and diverges from some of the conclusions that he made, that he came to. And finally, thinking about the new kinds of work and gaps that still exist in thinking about old Lagos in this sense. So British abolition, religion, and culture was producing what the newspapers of the day called a new kind of African on the West African coast. And so focusing on the Lagos press was an excellent choice for really thinking about an examination of Lagos society in this time period. And I always like to use this image as one of my favorite quotes about Lagos from the Lagos Observer in 1882. It's a response to that they got that, Joe, we have your letter, but we regret to say that it is crowded out of this issue. You forget that Lagos has what England has not, a climate. It is composed of equal parts of sunshine, mosquitoes, sand, high temperature, sweetness, light, fury, rain, rage, retribution, and that kind of thing. So when I think of this source, I often think about how can we reproduce this kind of liveliness about Lagos and this energy and all of these conflicting feelings I'm sure people are already having. I mean, anybody who's been in Lagos, and many as you are there now, how do we reproduce this excitement, this kind of understanding of the city? So for me, while the newspapers from the Anglo-African in the 1860s to the Observer of the 1880s and others cannot reproduce the voices of every section of Lagos society, one seldom encounters historical sources that are so lively yet so contradictory, but still offer some of the personality that Lagos and Lagosians undoubtedly had in this time period. Of course, the book has the most, hello? I said, of course, the book has the most, thank you, Abasade. Of course, the book has the most Victorian Lagos cover one can imagine, the image of Sarah Forbes Bonetta and her husband, JPL Davis. So the first thing I did last week when I was preparing for this was to look for the book's bibliography, which of course it does not have, as Damola mentioned earlier. While the book is concise and well-written and extremely well-researched, it is relatively short for something of this importance. And so when I think of all that he must have lost because of the Biafran War, with respect to his notes, the materials, all the things he had done, it makes me wonder what this book would have been if he had had the peace and the space to write and really complete the material with the material that he had in mind. So to pivot to some of the questions that you had, and so apart from the structural adjustment and others, there, as you said, there's so many things that make this kind of work so difficult for so many of us. So as you said earlier, I'm an urban historian of 19th century Lagos, and I'm particularly interested in how the histories of maps and the practice of map making can help us access the past. In addition, I've been thinking recently about how the city itself is an archive of its own past, and how Lagos's history is embedded in its quarters, its monuments, landmarks, streets, markets, all of these things, and of course in the streets and in the street names themselves. So reading the book for this panel, I was particularly struck by two things. The first is when he sets the Lagos scene. So not only does he set a cultural space, looking at how people and culture intersect in pace, he also gives us the city itself. So he really takes us to Lagos, to the different quarters, the Marina, Ologbo, all these places in Lagos. So we almost feel like, in a way, that we are there, whether or not the city seems to, quote, measure up. But then there's also, as you said, this kind of groundbreaking intellectual history of Lagos. So for me, this is really the first intellectual history of Lagos that I encountered. And so who are these, what is Victorian Lagos and who are these people? To quote from page 110, in the early stages of the development of West Africa, we have the creation of a largely cosmopolitan elite, professionally competent, Black in complexion, Western in culture, centered around the administrative capitals and commanding, quite rightly, the holy paternalism of the British administrators. So in a way, this book is painting a complex picture of a rapidly changing and growing society where we have these Black Africans who are thinking about how to exist in a world that's rapidly changing because of the advances of British imperialism and colonialism in this era. So the book points to a tension in Lagos society. We have these people who are Yoruba and others who are invested in their local identities and culture, be they from the interior, from the African diaspora, from Sierra Leone, with the Igbo, if they're Chinese from Brazil. But on the other hand, there's a very strong pull to assimilate, to demonstrate that one was well-versed in the requirements of what British administrators called to be civilized in that sense. So nowhere is this debate more vibrant than when we see it in the pages of the Lagos Press and as they report what is happening in the streets of the city. So in discussing the paradox of the new kind of African, to quote, who after assimilating and absorbing British culture, education, and etiquette, then began to struggle with their own identities. For me, what really struck me and connected with my own research is a discussion of names, what people called themselves, why they changed their names, and of course, the street names that Payne used in 1868 to name the city. We see Lagos streets are a mix of English and Yoruba, leaning heavily more towards Yoruba. So as we see as the city is changing because of British colonialism, we're also seeing this sort of holding on to the past in place in the ways that the city is named and extended. And so, of course, all of this is centered on William Lawson's map from 1885, which he drew for the Colonial and Indian exhibition, which is a plan of the town of Lagos, where not only did he redraw the city, he also named so many people, where they lived, where they worked, all of these things. Yet at the same time, he was clear to identify himself as a native of West Africa. So for me, it seems like Echeruo's understanding of Victorian Lagos is one that is successful in terms of society and culture, but not in terms of the urban fabric. It is here in his descriptions of Lagos and in the analysis of the urban fabric that my own work diverges most sharply from his. The idea of Victorian Lagos leans towards a comparison of Lagos with the metropole. And while culturally the Lagos elite have some success, their city, Eko, falls far short of living up to the ideals by which it is measured. There's all this talk. So in a way, the Lagos that he's looking at is colonial Lagos, right? And everything that's sort of local and indigenous sort of falls short of what we imagine the city to be. And all of the complaints and everything that we see from the press, which we could say he reads quite uncritically, but as we know, the context of production was quite difficult, right? In my way, thinking about Lagos in this way gives too much weight to the colonial understanding of the city, to Portuguese architecture, to thinking about what is brought to the city rather than what the city itself has to offer. So I think that in a way, this view of Lagos is really aspirational and leaves the original city falling short in that sense. So I would say that this happened at the expense of what is indigenous and grounded in local Yoruba understandings of how to use space, how to build, how to destroy, how to live in community, who and what to worship, etc. So to conclude, I would say that the field has changed dramatically in the ways that we think about urban space, urban history, and urban politics in African cities, especially in Lagos, Freetown, Accra, places like that. And of course, even the ways we look at newspapers have changed. As I said quickly earlier, in a way we can say that Echeruo's work is, well, because he reproduced these newspapers, the critical sort of reading that we would do nowadays is sometimes missing. But like, as I said, this is also a matter of context. So when I think about whose cities is, one of the things, of course, in my work, I'm interested in maps, how we can mix in maps with our understanding of the past, what evidence people in Lagos left on the maps. And even like this map of Glover's from 1859, where we first see the indigenous quarters of the city for the first time rendered in space. We learn so much about old Lagos when we look at different sources. I think newspapers are really important as well. So I said to conclude earlier, I really am concluding now. So what does the future hold with this book as a springboard? I think clearly we need more research on old Lagos. We need to move away from this kind of colonial, I think, a colonial understanding of the city and really grapple with what it means for Lagos to be a space for people who are indigenous, people who move there, and people who are not assimilating, people who are resisting and continue to resist these European incursions the city. What will it mean if we pivot? And these images come from Fortier's images of the city in the early 20th century. What would it mean to think more seriously about Lagos as an indigenous Yoruba space, rather than one that's always trying to be, you know, closer to London, closer to something different, right? So of course, we need more research on old Lagos. We need more intellectual histories, more spatial histories, and we need this work to be comparative across the West African coast, across the African diaspora. We're thinking about Lagos, but we should be thinking about Freetown. We should be thinking, I think we should be thinking about Accra. We should be thinking about a wide variety of spaces when we're thinking about cities in West Africa. But also we need more newspapers. Even though when we only use things like the Anglo-African and the Lagos Observer, there is a clear gap in the historiography. And that gap is from the late 60s to the end of the 1870s, because there are very few papers in circulation at the time. Many of the sources are missionary sources. So I would recommend for anyone who's interested in learning more about this to look to the African Times, which, while it didn't start being printed in West Africa, it reproduces these really vibrant debates around Lagos in the 1860s and 1870s, a space that is really kind of a historical gap in our understanding of the old city. I use a lot of these sources in my own work. I have a whole chapter on thinking about justice, race, and space, and how people experience justice in this newly colonial city in this time period. So I'll stop there because I think I'm out of time. And if anyone is interested in the African Times, I can share many of the copies because it's not always so easily accessible online. Thank you very much. How do I stop share?
Thank you very much.
Of course. Hold on. I'm trying to stop my share, but now it's not stopping. Oh, here it is. Good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming to this session. And thank you to our organizers for bringing this book back up. I know one of the other sessions has a book that has been reprinted after over 50 years. And I wonder if this can also experience that fortune. I started reading this, I don't remember the first time I read Echeruo's book. And although it was a book that's in my psyche and that I've used in my work, I felt as I was rereading it for this panel, like I was reading it anew. And like Ademide, Dr. Adelusi Adelui, I too was very kind of taken by the prose, the prose of the book itself, but also of, the choice quotes that he's like pulling out from the newspapers. So you can see he's very much into language and musicality, and so it was very interesting to hear this intellectual biography of him that you gave us, because now it all kind of makes sense in a way. And it's also interesting to think about what non-historians do when they take historical approaches, and how it can be very opening of new possibilities, new directions, new kinds of questions. So that's really that was really great. I suppose one of the things that I had so many thoughts. He has so many thoughts in this book, and I had so many thoughts reading it. And he also has so many feelings. One of the things that I took away from the book was the way in which his analyses can be very kind of judgmental, and his voice is very sharp, but it's also just very present. I don't mind it, it's just the kind of voice. But it's also just very present, right? Like his personality is very present, the emotions are very present, feelings about things, his thoughts. And I remember thinking that in the section on education, when he was talking about the various experiments in trying to standardize the education system in 19th century Lagos, trying to expand it to girls, trying to think about, well, can Muslims partake of this liberal education, and how that changed Muslim education in Lagos from the rest of the country, really. How experiments in trying to expand to higher levels of education in Lagos, and the debate about what kind of education do we need in this place? Should we be studying Latin and these allegedly classical subjects, or should we be, looking towards a more, Booker T. Washington type of instrumental, technical kind of education? What kind of education? So there's so many debates and there's so much going on. And in a way, he ends up characterizing these debates and many of the other debates that he surveys in the books as symptoms of a certain kind of confusion, uncertainty, and there are various sources that he ascribes as the origins of this confusion and uncertainty about how to proceed, how to style the city, how to style life in Lagos, that I found to be really one way to go in looking at those kind of sources, and a way to go that reflects something about who he was and his personality and maybe his mood at the time. One of the moods that I saw as kind of running through the book was a kind of a tragic mood. There's a kind of, when one starts from the introductory kind of context of the book's production, where it talks about really having gone through the war, having been working on this long-standing project, having it all kind of demolished through the war, and then having to scramble at one point to pull together a project again. I thought to myself, the war the Civil War is a moment in which, for someone like him from the East, is a moment in which you're confronted with a profound question of your belonging and membership or not, and exclusion. And that question is also one that the people he's looking at in the 19th century are trying to tease out for themselves, right? Even though they're in a kind of bubble within Lagos, through which they are being observed too by the rest of the city. So there's this question of how do we see in these newspapers them trying to assert belonging, them trying to elaborate the terms of belonging, what it would mean, what belonging to what, So there's this kind of mirroring between what he might have been experiencing after the Biafran War, and during and after, but especially after, and what they might have been experiencing too. Many of them, as he talks about, there are people who come from, various parts of the diaspora, are people who are in Lagos as a very paradoxical refuge from some other place of escape, or maybe a trauma, right, that they've left and they have come to Lagos. So there's that parallelism between their experiences too. And so I was wondering, as I'm reading, I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but as I'm reading, I'm wondering how his own subjective experience is informing his reading of their experiments in Lagos, the things that are reflected, debates that are reflected in these newspapers. Then the fact that he generally concludes in each chapter, the chapter on education, the chapter on the religious debate, which religion is the true religion of the Black man? The chapter on music, what kind of music is delightful to us, and how do we judge what is the criteria by which we judge the aesthetics, the beauty of certain kinds of music? All of these debates, he generally concludes that in 19th century Lagos, that there was a preference, that there was a kind of a preference or a defaulting really to forms of life, forms of music or religion or education that tended to hew closer to what he considered to be European models, right? And part of the tragedy of that is that we're not in Europe, right? So it will always be a kind of simulation of something else, and the result will always be a form of, will always represent a kind of second step or a lack or a lag, and so that is also kind of the underlying, to me, tragic note in the way he analyzes what people were talking about and debating and trying out in the 19th century. The debate over naming, and Ademide has also pointed out, the chapters almost read to me as, symptoms of the same problem for him, symptoms of a general syndrome of confusion and uncertainty that governs kind of the life and mentality in Lagos in the 19th century. And even the title, Victorian Lagos, got me thinking that too, because I was thinking, what is it to be Victorian? Sometimes, definitely temporally, it refers to a certain, period of time in the 19th century. It's debated, is it 1820 to 1914? Is it 1837 to 1901? But, it's roughly the first quarter of the 19th century to more or less the end, and maybe a little beyond. What makes it go a little beyond has to do with the idea of the Victorian era is not like a time period, but as a period that has a certain character somehow, and a character whose qualities we think we know, but they're so fluid actually. But we still kind of characterize a certain period and aesthetic and lifestyles, etc., as Victorian. And that title, the Victorian Lagos, centers the United Kingdom as the referent, right? So it's like Lagos of the Victorians, right? Like the Lagos that belong to the Victorians, and that is a constant kind of reference that he's reading into the debates that are happening in the Lagos newspapers, the constant reference to Europe. But he himself is also periodically referencing Nigeria, right? So it's like Lagos in relationship to the UK and under Victoria, the rule of Queen Victoria's period, in this, this era of so much change, but then also Lagos in relation to Nigeria, which is really, anachronistic in a way. But this is the world that he lives in. Lagos's primary relationship is to Nigeria in the 1970s. And so the Lagos of the period he's talking about is always kind of in being read against something. So that too, that reading against is also to me struck me as a kind of a reading of a lack, right? Like it's always like the contrast against something that you're not. But periodically, occasionally, he offers that, well, there might be another way of thinking about this, although he's not sure that it's really the central important way, but he has to mention it. And these are the moments in which he talks about the debates less as representative of confusion and uncertainty about how to be, which way to go, and what we want for ourselves, but more as a representation of maybe innovation, actually, right? Innovation and a kind of he uses the term cosmopolitanism, right? There's a cosmopolitanism in the sense that there are these influences coming into the city, into this subculture within the city from various parts of the Atlantic world, at least. And you see these influences in a lively and dynamic and maybe even a productive juggling with each other. And he also talks about the possibility of reading these debates as I said, as reflecting a certain kind of innovativeness, even to the point of innovating oneself. Like, how do you kind of self-author, identify, create a new identity for yourself? And that I think is one of the most interesting and maybe generative ways to look at this 19th century period. There's a window of time in which there seemed to be a lot more possibility for self-authoring, self-experimentation, and so there are these dual ways in which the debate can be understood, right? As kind of moving engaging productively with the range of possibilities that seem to be on the table for the people in this society at that particular moment in time. Or the other way, as a sign of the confusion that bedeviled the people in this society at that moment in time. I think in my work, I tend more towards analyzing this period as a period of creativity and possibility. And but I think I also find it very useful to I did find it very useful to re-engage with the analyses that Echeruo landed on, because I think that they still inform a lot of how historians of Lagos, some maybe not represented in this room, but maybe many not actually, but there is a contingent of historians of Lagos who really are more likely to understand, to analyze the experiments and debates of this period as symptoms of a kind of crisis that is like destructive rather than generative. Am I done? Okay, I'm out of time. Well, since I'm out of time, the last thing I want to say has to do with something, just to echo something that Dr. Adeluyi already said, is that, you know, even though the title is Victorian Lagos, really the book is about a subculture within Victorian Lagos. We might even say it's about a neighborhood within Lagos. And the contrast between the claims of the title versus the contents of the papers, and therefore of the book that the papers that is based on those papers, begs a question of, you know, what other Lagoses are there? What other subcultures, what other Lagoses are there living in parallel to the one that the book is focused on? And how do we as historians in this generation, who have a more, not that we have an absolutely global view of this historical period, but more perhaps than that we can build on from past scholars, how do we bridge the various worlds of Lagos that existed in this 19th century period towards a periodization that is derived from Lagos itself, right, as opposed to from the British Empire? Okay, thank you.
Well, just as my PowerPoint is coming up, I just want to thank the organizers for just organizing this panel. I'm really honored to be just in conversation with scholars that I have admired for a very, very long time. I also want to say very quickly that this is emotional for me. I am a child of University of Lagos. Between my two parents, they worked for Unilag for 41 years. And so this is a kind of homecoming for me. I can wax for about 3 hours, lecture for about 3 hours about my experience being back on this campus and all the schools that I went to. One of my childhood friends is actually at the back, but I need to stay on task. And so I will just delve into the presentation. So let's see if this works. Oh. No, yeah, that one. There we go. So let's see if this works. Okay, brilliant. Okay. And so so I should also say it's interesting that Victorian Lagos, Echeruo's work has been such an inspiration for historians of various kinds. Even our host today invoked, and rightfully so, the idea that Victorian Lagos, the book itself, was and is a cultural history. And Victorian Lagos is not a perspective of Lagos from an historian's viewpoint. These are the words of Echeruo himself. So Echeruo was much humbler about his project. And so I find this discourse about how I find this, I just find the fact that it has been such an inspiration for historians, it's almost quite ironic because of Echeruo's words himself. On page 15, Professor Echeruo states in the first sentence that his book is not a history of Lagos. The book is rather a portrait of 19th century Lagos through English language newspapers, as our host stated, started by African diasporic residents, as well as Lagosian elites. Professor Echeruo's book belongs to a genre of literature that is not as popular in current academic circles as it once was. That is, to try to capture an age through the documents that were produced in that very era. By documents, we're talking about newspaper articles and newspapers. I want to call your attention to the word portraits. In arts, a portrait depicting something is only one perspective of that very thing being depicted. It also suggests that other portraits of the same thing that is being depicted could be made. One can also recall the Igbo proverb that says that one cannot take in the spectacle of a masquerade from one angle. If one is part of a circle of people watching a masquerade perform in the middle of the circle, one knows that my glimpse of the dancing masquerade will differ from what the person to my right-hand side and to my left-hand side are seeing. And I'm reminded of the road tour, part of this conference that happened about 2 or 3 days ago, with people dancing, the performance art, the way people circled around, and all of the perspectives of those individual people around were actually different. And so to return to the idea of a portrait, it's a representation of something and not the thing in all of its complexity. It is then logical to say that Echeruo's Victorian Lagos was not, in the thought of the German historian Leopold von Ranke, an attempt to construct a scientific history of the Lagos of that era. Professor Echeruo's ambition was much more limited. And then the value of this interdisciplinary panel is that we can bring different perspectives to 19th century Lagos. But back to Echeruo's book, what is Victorian Lagos? Moving from defining what it is via negativa, or in other words, in the negative, to what it is in the positive. It is an extraordinary attempt or a portrait that reconstructs, condenses, and summarizes the patterns of life and thought of a segment of residents that had a tremendous influence in a region encompassing Eko, and which, through the presence of various Europeans, ultimately took on the anglicized name Lagos. Echeruo's portrait of newspapers in Lagos showed the attempt of some to chronicle and shape the place's future, just borrowing language from Professor Adelus Adelui in talking about the aspirational edge to what they were doing. In this short presentation, I reflect on the ways that these newspaper people deployed certain types of style in English language ornamental prose, and the way that other settlers created ornamental architecture in order to build an utopian future, an aspirational future for themselves and for the parts of Lagos they inhabited. And so this presentation is going to be a close reading of the language that they employed in some of the letters, but also the architecture as well. To put my presentation in more succinct language, I hope to show how the prose style of a letter to the editor section of the Lagos Observer, as well as the style of one building, the Shitabe Mosque, show how these influential group of Lagos residents sought to create a progressive, forward-looking Lagos for themselves, as well as people of African descent. Formalistically, the style of the English prose that certain writers employed and certain stylistic elements of buildings that some of these individuals erected were trying to accomplish a socially engineered Lagos of the future. I will be the first to grant that in the letters, there is a sense that the authors were speaking to themselves. In Echeruo's book, there are excerpts of letters from writers picking pseudonyms such as Quintilian, who interestingly was an ancient Roman author of a treatise on rhetoric. Other names included Nereus, the Greek mythological figure of an old man of the sea, Gaius, a Roman jurist, right? And so these letters, by using these names to identify themselves, right? These Greco-Roman names. These letters illustrate a command not only of English prose literature, but also ancient Greco-Roman literature. Replicated here is one example of a letter from a writer with the pseudonym of Methodist, published in the Lagos Observer of April 1882. Echeruo called our attention to it in the book. And just to read it out loud, our friend, he included, has all along been to use the vulgar parlance, beating about the bush. His statements are what Quintilian would be led to call an empty torrent of words. Has he not fallen on the Charybdis while unwarrantably warning me to escape the Scylla, to endeavor to show the unprofitable discussion of another in this manner would be no less than to attempt the Sisyphean task of rolling uphill what Virgil terms the insurmountable stone. Now, notice the mention in this letter of Quintilian that I alluded to earlier. Noteworthy too is the use of words such as parlance, almost foreign to our own age, but more in use of the English-speaking world of the 19th century. What should one even say about the empty torrent of words? A phrase that conjures images of unrelenting rain, noise, and emptiness. There are also references to significant events in Greco-Roman literature. Charybdis, which I have highlighted in red, the first Charybdis, and Scylla that you see right here were two sea monsters in Greek mythology. Such figures evoke human tales of gallantry and heroism and trying to overcome impossible odds told in the Greco-Roman world. This suggests to this speaker that the writer Methodist in this letter was not only well-versed in the literature, he expected his readers to be versed as well. The 19th century English phrase, between the Charybdis and the Scylla, refers to when one must choose between two seemingly dangerous choices. The Sisyphean, the Sisyphean task that you see right here is a metaphor for an enterprise that is impossible to complete. Yet, and this is one of the points I want to make, there was something subversive about the deployment of such Greco-Roman metaphors in a Lagosian newspaper. The editors of such newspapers like the Eagle and the Critic, the Lagos Times, the Anglo-African, and so on, were cosmopolitan people. Professor George mentioned this, of African descent who had considerable financial means. Their newspapers were supposed to be a mirror reflection of their status as erudites in the English language and of their aspirations to create a modern Lagos governed by cosmopolitan people of African descent. Though these aspirations did not reflect their current reality, such words were building blocks of a desired future. In other words, such prosaic writings were an attempt to build an oral architecture for a future Lagos, a written architecture of their own, building structures of ornamental words, that is, words that were musical beside the point, but entertaining nonetheless. and conveying insights in a way that married the form of the prose with its message. Such a marriage of form and function was a signature style of 19th century English prose, deployed by English authors such as Walter Pater, Thomas Carlyle, and others. Yet beyond the flowery nature of the prose, I also want to suggest that the letters to editors, similar to this one, use such mental pictures of stories from the Greco-Roman world in an ironic way, calling to attention how they too owned such a style of English prose, and that a modern Lagos should have as its readers such erudite people with financial means and a certain social standing in the community. I'm using ironic here intentionally because there's a postmodern edge. There's a way this is a kind of postmodernism before postmodernism became something, just became a thing in the academic world. Now, speaking of I mentioned one of the papers earlier, the Eagle and Lagos Critic. Who you see right here is the financier of the newspaper, Richard Blaze, a Sierra Leonean settler in Lagos. And this newspaper, actually it's the Lagos Times and the Gold, I beg your pardon, Lagos Times and the Gold Coast Advertiser that he was an owner of, which was published in 1880. His editor had no qualms about using a 19th century style, English style, for the paper's agenda of critiquing the British colonial government in matters of the public good, but also praising the achievements of people of African descent in the city, building a progressive Lagosian society of peoples of African descent with a style created by the English. And Richard Blaze was part of a circle of people, including people I will identify here. You see Richard Blaze right here. Here you see Edward Blyden, the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist who was in Lagos in the 1890s. Here you have Shita Bey, who's mentioned on page 87 of Victorian Lagos, and it's to him I will turn because of his impact on architecture and bringing architecture, ornamental architecture into the equation. But just to give you a sense of some of the other figures, this is Obai Oyekon, who you see seated right here. I'm also indebted to Professor Book Kola Babigasin, who is going to speak in the other panel on this as well. James Davis, who is on the cover of with Sarah Bonetta Forbes. Professor Adilusi Adelu mentioned her, but this is her husband right here. But we also have Otumba Payne, who was also mentioned in Victorian Lagos, right there. And J.S. Slay, one of the diplomats. But just moving on page 87, I'm bringing in ornamental architecture. We're not only aspirational in terms of creating ornamental words and using a kind of English prose, they were also aspirational in creating a kind of ornamental architecture. This is the Shita Bay Mosque that is still standing, but was built in 1894, that featured, again, on page 87 of Victorian Lagos. It was financed by Shita Bey, who you saw in the turban in the previous picture. And there's a way in which, again, just like how they took over a certain kind of English prose. They took over certain architectural forms, some of which are Greco-Roman as well. I want to call your attention to what in Roman architecture are called, or is called the oculus, Latin for eye. It's a feature of Roman architecture here. There are also other references I'm going to mention. But there's a way in which the newspapers, especially the Lagos Weekly Record of 1894, covered this building, covered the opening ceremony of this building. This building is distinctive in how it was a collaboration of diasporic settlers who were in Lagos. Shita Bey himself was born in Freetown. Porfirio and Martin, who I mentioned here, who were the builders, came from Brazil. There is more than likely the possibility that Porfirio was a Catholic a Catholic building a mosque, an Afro-Brazilian Catholic building a mosque for Sierra Leonean immigrants. But just to give you a sense of, this is a picture taken, and Professor Badigasi might talk about this in her own talk, but this was taken by, this picture particularly was taken by an individual, Da Costa, who it's debatable, he may have been an Afro-Brazilian himself. This is a more recent picture based in the 1970s, and there's a way in this architecture, certainly not only a Greco-Roman architectural language is being marshaled to a Lagosian elite end, but also the form itself, speaking about form, and I want to call attention to this triangular form. In architectural terms, this is referred to as a broken pediment, and you get this from Renaissance and Baroque architecture. And so the sources that these people who have no qualms about using these sources are deploying to their own ends are varied, they're multivarious in a sense. But also I want to call your attention to the tile work that is also reminiscent of tile work on the exterior of buildings in Brazil. And so there's this allusion to Brazil, many sources that are being referenced. I want to call your attention again to another element, right? And that is the element of pinnacles that you see right here that have been used in Gothic architecture. There's a way in which this building, this Shitabe Mosque, was really a laboratory of experimentation. Professor George talks about confusion. I like to think about it in terms of a dilemma of style. You know, which style should we use, and so on and so forth. There is this dilemma, there's this creative dilemma that is going on. And in the case of the pinnacles, not only does this architecture transform this Gothic pinnacle, you can't really see it here, but this is a lunar crescent that is symptomatic of Islamic, Islamic, and so there's a way in which they're not just copying, right, these references, they are taking them and making them their own. And there's a way in which, very ornamentally in prose and architecture, they are doing this. All of this to foster a socially engineered, we can have a debate about the term, but there's a way, there's an intentionality in this vision of Lagos that they're trying to construct that this is showing. But one other thing I wanted to mention is just the triangular nature of, let me go back to illustrate this point. I made allusion to the triangular nature, the broken pediment of this. That's another form that these people are appropriating. And you can see the triangular nature in this form, but you can also see it in another mosque that sadly has come down. It was the old central mosque of Lagos that was built in 1913, but sadly in the 1980s it was demolished. But just notice the triangular nature, notice the allusion. This building right here, just to give you a sense of what these buildings are. Like I mentioned, on your left-hand side, the Central Mosque in Lagos. On your right-hand side is the Cathedral of the Jesuits in Rome. And there's a way in which these Afro-Brazilians, these people of the diaspora, were just really, just taking these forms, having no qualms because of their own socially engineered vision of what Lagos could be. One of the questions you asked is, who's Lagos, right? And there's a way in which they were, it's as if this community was speaking to themselves and they were constructing the Lagos for themselves. And it's a portrait. There is no doubt that there is room for many narratives of Lagos. And I really like what both of my fellow panelists said about just, the non-Western trained voices and all of that. There's a way, but ironically, there's a way in which these individuals were really marshalling. They were interested in indigeneity as well, but they thought of indigeneity very differently. Yes, and with that, I just want to bring this to a close, because in the sense that what I'm the way in which this work, this extraordinary work has sparked my own interest, and on rereading it in preparation for this presentation today, I'm just struck by the flexibility the flexibility of these people of a certain social standing to marshal certain forms, ornamental forms in prose, but also in architecture as well, to create their own vision of Lagos. There's no doubt it's a curated vision of Lagos, and there are many Lagoses. There are some Lagoses that they left out. But in thinking about this book, there's something very postmodern. I invoked that term before. There's something very postmodern about this, even before postmodernism became a thing. Because the thing about the essence of postmodernism is to take things out of their context and marshal them to serve certain ends in a way that is ironic. And you see that kind of creative irony going on right here. And with that, I will stop and I welcome the questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much to all three speakers for giving us a lot of food for thought. I have just one question. I'm invoking my right to chair of this session. We have 10 minutes before the end of the session. So it ends at 9:45, or I guess we can take no more than 5 minutes because they would have to prepare for the next session. I'm saying this so that when the floor is open, we can keep the comments and everything brief. And my question is also, it's more of a comment or more like a debate, but I'm also going to keep it brief. And so I'm thinking that confusion, dilemma of style, mixed match, different styles. Is it a function of writers of the 1970s? Or is it something that the fact that people, when writers write about this period, because my experience reading other writers of 19, for instance, Emmanuel Ayodele, who also wrote about the educated elites in 19th century. Emmanuel Ayodele is a Nigerian historian, professor of history. He was also quite, even much more forceful than Echeruo was, and even uses Arabic language and crude, if I can use that, was to describe these guys. And I feel that, and this is where I'm inviting you to quickly comment, I feel that is it that the 19th century was more present to scholars of the 1970s? Does it look like, was it like present to them? Like, because obviously people were still alive who lived in the 19th century by the 1970s, right? So during the 1970s, there were people who were born in the 19th century who were still alive. So was it the case that they were a product of their times and that they were still seeing those who were born in the 19th century as contemporaries? Maybe that was why they wrote in such tones, because it's similar to how people write about the 1990s today. When people write about the 1990s, 1980s, they write with such emotional attachment and making subjective statement because it's present, it's not past to these writers. So I'm thinking whether that's the same, whether the same question can be asked. I have other thoughts, other questions, other accusations in mind, but then I'll leave, since we don't have time, and I've taken 2 minutes already, I'll just stop. Anyone?
David, okay.
I tend to think that's a great question, and I tend to think that there's something about I tried to allude to that, like the reference on one hand is to the nation state of Nigeria, and then the other hand to the kind of British Empire, and they're both these state formations that seem, I think, to be clearly identified in terms of their population, like who is what, right? And that's within, and also there are these state formations that persist in some form or another into his era, into the era of the 1970s. I feel like there's something about like a subculture or a society that is that can be more ephemeral, maybe in some ways, than like a nation or a national culture, or even like an imperial nation in a way, and that that ephemerality tells me to approach it with no expectations, as a completely strange place that really can't be compared to what I might be familiar with, in the era of the nation state. And so I wonder if writers in the 60s and 70s really allowed for the 19th century to be peculiar and its own kind of peculiar thing, its own peculiar logic. He did, even Echeruo did at the very end of the book, in the conclusion, where he talks about how Lagos was understood by these writers of this period as in relationship to Accra, to Freetown, to other Atlantic, Philadelphia, to other Atlantic cities, Black cities in the Atlantic that they were aware of. Like that was their understanding, their spatial understanding of the universe that they were in. Very different from a spatial understanding of Lagos as a city within Nigeria, right, enclosed. And so I just wonder about the possibility of really imagining how strange the 19th century would be to a 20th century, a late 20th century mind.
Thank you. Anyone else? Should we just take questions?
I think that was.
Thank you very much for that. One sentence, the last thing that struck me was the idea of Lagos being the center of the universe of the residents of Lagos. And that's true, actually, even up to the 1940s, when Lagos was already part of Nigeria. Lagosians will still write like the old Lagos colony, evoking the sense of the old Lagos. And the fact that Lagos is like the London, like Lagos was the place to be. The place, like London is the place to be, Lagos was the place to be. And the idea that even other travelers from Ondo or from Ekiti are like foreigners, aliens in Lagos. So I don't know, the history of nation building in Nigeria maybe goes way back. The floor is open to anyone who would like to say something. Team, thank you.
Thanks so much for such a rich and fascinating discussion. I read this book about 10 years ago. I'm going to be brief. So it's not that clear in my head, but what I remember is my impression is, wow, this is quite harsh. And I bracket it exactly with Ayandele's The Educated Elite in the Nigerian Society from a few years before. I wonder if one way of approaching these two texts is by seeing them as much about Nigerian educated elites in the 1970s as in the 1870s. And there's a certain irony in the quite harsh analysis of Ayandele and Echeruo in the book, in that they are the Nigerian educated elite of an area. So interpreting the Nigerian educated elite of an earlier era so harshly perhaps speaks ironically to a certain amount of confusion in that era. So perhaps these are two artifacts as much as Nigeria in the 1970s. As about that sensible earlier subject, just a thought I'll be interested in.
Okay, I don't want to monopolize. I have some thoughts on that.
Go ahead.
I mean, my thought on that is that, there, as we've been saying, there are multiple groups within Lagos, there are multiple subcultures. And this whole idea of the elites being synonymous with the educated elite or the Western educated elite or the Western literate elite is, I think, a big fallacy that has kind of plagued the field of Lagos studies. Because there are other elites, there are other elites in Lagos that are not part of this, that are not being written about in these same works. And my point about bridging is that the impression one would get from the scholarship is about a very pronounced break between these two communities, and they're not really in dialogue with each other. That, I think, is a fallacy. And but what is interesting is like which elites demonstrate a kind of ambivalence about their position within the society, and which ones really do not, right? I mean, maybe what we're seeing mirrored by the scholars toward the periods they're studying is also an ambivalence about being in their position within a very class stratified society. But traditional elites are not that ambivalent about being the elite in a very stratified traditional society. So there are different kinds of elites who feel different kinds of ways about social stratification, all within Lagos. So
let me just add, but I think it connects to what you said about belonging. You know, just in your own presentation, just the fact that some of these people, like Shita Bay, for instance, relocated to Lagos from Freetown, the Afro-Brazilians who built the Shita Bay Mosque, some of whom had incredibly harsh experiences in Brazil, and they were starting afresh. And with that, you know, there are accounts of Afro-Brazilian immigrants where there were fights between fathers and sons, where the fathers were, the sons were saying that we are Brazilians, we're not Africans, and the fathers were saying we're Africans. And so the kind of confusion, right, amongst these people played out as a result of this desire for belonging, as a result of their harsh experiences in the places they were coming from. So I wanted to just add that to the dimension as well, that maybe that also accounts for some of this confusion that we're talking about.
confusion is not my term.
Okay.
It is Echeruo's term.
Okay, fair point. Fair point. Fair point. Fair point.
Folks, I'm sorry, I didn't, there seems to be another voice beside you in another room, so I didn't completely hear the question from the audience.
So,
do you want to move the microphone?
So, but I was just gonna say, like, with Abosede, with Dr. George's points, I was just thinking about this quote, which of course I'm not going to remember at this time of the night, that this idea that the past is a foreign country and they do things differently there. I'm really struck by this idea of, you know, the tone everyone is talking about, and is there something distinctive about the way that, let's say, this wave of historians after the sort of early nationalist historians from the 1960s and others, you know, is this really different from the work of people like Ade Ajayi or others, right? Is there something we're detecting in their tone? And it's really making me think about a sort of, what is the impact of this sort of lingering despair? This is 1970s Nigeria, right? This is post-war, this is post maybe stack, you know, things that the initial sort of optimism is really fading. And I'm thinking about it now, that reflecting on the way, the tone of the book, there's really a lingering despair in the prose that we see here. And I've never really thought of 70s historiography altogether, but now I'm really thinking that we really have to, and these are not things we talk about as historians, right? This idea that this acerbic response to this text, to these texts in that sense, but obviously the acerbic tone in the text. So I'm really struck by the question, and I wonder even how we will be evaluated in this sense, those of us who are producing work in this time period. You know, we're not the generation of those who fled in the beginning, you know, after the coups and after the military regimes and all of that. But, you know, we're in a different kind of wave that's happening now. And I wonder how our perspectives, maybe we're too hopeful in our generation, if we're all in the same generation, if I can claim all of you. But I'll stop
Yeah, my contribution is just to make a point, to try and get everyone to understand the fact that this guy was narrating his experience of Lagos in 1977. We'd just come out of a civil war shortly before that. So that was a great big influence on his perspective. And if you don't understand, I mean, from independence till about that time, there's a lot of polarity within the country. So you'd expect that kind of voice from someone coming in from the East. I suspect this guy's from the East. So that's actually where that sort of language actually comes from. That's my perspective on this. And I'm going to also, you know, go with his contribution when he said, you know, when he was talking about the kind of language used by the Ellis in Nigeria at that time. These were more or less colonized people still, yeah. So there was still going to be that that sort of language coming in from pretty much everyone. If you check most of historical documents and from writers from that period, you'd find that. And you'd also find, people coming in from different perspectives, from different backgrounds, trying to make their voice and their perspective known on this issue. That's actually what I'm trying to put out there, the situation the country was in before then. And at that point in time, 77, there was a coup about that time also, Muritala's coup. The country was not really that settled. So there was a lot of poison in the air. So I think that's probably why this guy is actually the way he is. Thank you.
So we get like writers well, it's important to also note that beyond the use of the word completion, 19th century is difficult to understand for me in the sense that these are people who would at once claim cultural nationalists. I'm referring to everyday people, the nationalists, those who lived during that time. They would live in cultural nationalists, dropping their English names eventually, the Paynes, the Johnsons, everything, and dropping their English clothes and inverting it to okay. But at the same time, would hold on to the Queen's English, would hold on to the use of like big words, not just that. Would also hold on to ideas, would see themselves as distinct from the rest of Nigeria, as people who would lead Nigeria to the promised land. Olufemi Taiwo, Cornell, calls them like apostles of modernity. In the other book, Africa must be more than the manifesto. Like these are guys who embody that contradiction in the sense that but one might also argue that they cherry picked what they thought was good. And that's the whole idea that some people see, that's the argument that some people are continuing to make, that we cannot say, okay, for those who are advocating a return to an Africa that predated colonialism, that's not possible because people have the right to like cherry pick what they want, different cultures and all of this stuff. And it's also important, I mean, there's some things where there's some funny or other interesting quotes that I've read about people drinking schnapps and other strong hot drinks in the afternoon. And some other on the other extreme, like somebody wearing winter jackets in Lagos as well. The images of that as well. Also, the images of Sarah Bonetta. If anyone would say, is the image of the quintessential Victorian woman with all the accoutrement, I've anyone seen document any YouTube videos how everything that makes the Victorian woman's dress, right? I mean, it's like I saw a clip like it's like 10 layers. And I'm wondering in Lagos, like how do you survive? So all of these things that I don't have the skills to analyze because images and material culture like outside of my own scope of training. But there are things that fascinate me as a historian, and perhaps we can be pardoned for asking some questions that would be deemed as naive by specialists of these fields. But then when we reflect on them and also see them as an hybrid product, although Yedide calls it the needed hybrids, which is such a straight that they're neither they're neither fish or fowl, they're like bats, they're never birds or rats, those kind of stuff. Like it's difficult to place it. So other scholars are also being critical of them, but I don't think that being critical of them is the right approach. I think one needs to study them in their own terms. We need to I'm more aligned to I was view that it was more like defining modernity in their own terms. Where I mean the fact that we even have newspapers to read today was a part of their own entrepreneurial mindset. They founded these newspaper companies, newspapers in West Africa, not just in Lagos, but also in Freetown and in Accra, weren't just colonial businesses, or like what you find in Southern Africa. They weren't owned by the colonial governments. They were primarily owned by Nigeria. Well, you call them Nigerians, I like to call them Africans. They were owned by Africans themselves. So they had agency, they could shape the story. And it's also easy to read stories that were pro-government and stories that were anti-government. That's Akintoye or Kintoye Ajasha in the later end of the 19th century was more pro-government in his own newspaper. So you can also read diverse voices and all of those things. And I think that historians and other scholars in the world, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. In fact, I'm looking forward to a time that a true movie reflecting 19th century Lagos so that we can actually see what life was. And I think we're going to take 5 more minutes to listen to Professor Ade, and then we'll land up.
Well, the only thing I want to add is Echeruo's book. If you compare him to his contemporaries, Gayatri Spivak was his classmate at Cornell. They were all taught by Paul Deman, that great deconstructionist. They all went to Jeffrey Hartman, who was also a great deconstructionist. They were all taught together at the same time in Cornell. They graduated about the same time. But what you will see in what is symptomatic about Echeruo's prose is that he didn't adopt the language of theory. That, for example, everything we've been talking about here is what Homi Bhabha will write about as mimicry, the dilemmas of mimicry. Does mimicry misshape the original? Is mimicry itself new? But Echeruo did not do that, and he was not alone in that. Even the other guy, Abiola Irele, who was also Francophone, Abiola Irele is of that era, of that period, he did not adopt that language, did negritude, but he did not adopt the language of high French or European theory. But they were more or less doing similar stuff. And I think that's one reason a person like Echeruo, we read him a lot in post-colonial studies. At least that's the way we read him in literature. We use him in post-colonial literature. But he never showed up at the level of theory because of the language he adopted, though he's describing the same thing. That's the unfortunate thing. Maybe it's fortunate. I do not know whether it's fortunate or not. Yeah.
We have a section in the Arabic where we used to be engaging with other categories of elites in Lagos, and I also read them basically going in this book. We have scholars of oral history, we have scholars of photography as well, we have also we have a public historian who does images and tries to contextualize Lagos today, like in present day Lagos, trying to like show us what they looked like in the 19th century and things like that. So, and he works actively on Instagram, the Facade Nigeria, that's his channel. I hope you will be here this afternoon. It's all going to be on Zoom, so please, wherever you are, whether you're here on campus or you're in your hotel room, please just click on the link in the program, in the final program in your email, and just join us. There will be no in-person component, it will be fully on Zoom. And if you're here on campus, there are rooms downstairs, quiet rooms, where you can Zoom in, where you can join to give your presentations or to just attend. Thank you very much. And thank you to Dr. Ede for joining us at morning. What time is it now? 2:45.
It is 2:52, and so I can catch an hour or so before my next panel.
Wow. So conference video. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.